And today we're answering that question. How can I transition from lead generation to demand generation? We've got 5 stages for you to go through. The context here, Kevin, is look, many marketers know that demand generation is one of the key paths to sustainable growth. But making that transition internally, it's a tough challenge. Welcome to the B2B Playbook. We built this channel for small B2B marketing teams who want to drive more revenue for their business. Every week, we're showing you how to create more demand for your brand step by step using our 5Bs framework. So if you're time poor, resource strapped, but you still want to make a big impact on your business, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button down below so you don't miss an episode. Welcome back to the B2B Playbook, listeners and viewers. Today, we are continuing our Demand Gen mini-series, and we're discussing the 5 steps that you need to take to transition from lead generation to demand generation. We are in season 6 of the show. This is the podcast where we've shown you step by step how to generate demand using our 5Bs framework. We are now deep into season 6, where we're continuing on this Demand Gen mini-series, where we're covering all the most common questions we get, Kevin, when it comes to how to implement demand generation, what we need to do to shift to this strategy. And today we are talking about the 5 steps that you need to take to transition from lead generation to demand generation. Before we dive into it, Kevin, can you please tell any new listeners what this podcast is all about and what we've been up to in our first 5 seasons?
In the first 5 seasons, we've been giving away our 5Bs framework, which is our framework for demand generation or B2B marketing as we see it, and releasing it step by step in those 5 seasons. So if you haven't already, go back and listen to these, and you can be selective in picking out the episodes that are relevant to your particular business and your journey. But to quickly cover off on what each of those 5Bs are, they were be ready, be helpful, be seen, be better, and be the best. That all started with deeply understanding your dream customers, developing relationships of trust with them online through your helpful content, and then amplifying that content and start to focus in on the people, your dream customers, that you really need to focus in on and optimizing that process. And finally, looking at advanced strategies and tactics in the industry, as well as building your own advanced strategies using the 5Bs framework as a more circular framework.
And today, Kevin, we're answering that question. How can I transition from lead generation to demand generation? We've got 5 stages for you to go through. The context here, Kevin, is look, many marketers know that demand generation is one of the key paths to sustainable growth. But making that transition internally, it's a tough challenge. If you have a team that's built on lead generation, chances are, Kevin, and we see this time and time again when we work with organizations, there's a large sales team because they're trying to service those leads, marketing is sending to them. And if you have an instant switch of your marketing strategy from lead gen to demand generation, it's going to drastically reduce the number of leads that they're getting. And even if there's an increase in quality that we would expect from demand generation, that means, Kev, there's going to be a bunch of salespeople with less to do and possibly redundancies. And guess what, marketers? Unfortunately, that's probably going to come back round to you. And Kevin, that's why we advocate for a gradual transition to demand generation, where you put in place a pilot program with not all your time and all your budget, but we say just carve out 10% of your time, 10% of your budget, prove that demand generation works before gradually scaling it up. And so today we're going to show you those 5 steps that you need to follow to make this transition from lead generation to demand generation, to make it as painless as possible.
Well, George, let's kick off this episode like we have done in every episode of this mini-series on demand generation by first quickly defining what demand generation is. Can you do that for us?
Sure thing, Kev. Listeners and viewers, demand generation is a go-to market strategy that builds an intense desire in your dream customer to purchase from you. Only 3 to 5% of your buyers are in market at any given time. You will run out of customers if you only focus on these buyers, which is why it's so hard for organizations to scale. Demand generation builds a relationship with the other 97% of the market that's unaware or problem aware. And when they're ready to buy, they're led to the logical conclusion that you are the best solution for them.
Very good, George. Now let's get into those 5 steps on how to transition from lead gen to demand generation, and hopefully very smoothly. So that first step then is making the business case for demand generation. Now, we've covered this in a previous episode, but let's quickly recap on that one as well.
That's right, Kevin. And making that business case is all about really showing that the status quo, what you're currently doing, what you're being instructed to do, isn't working or isn't going to be able to continue to scale and serve the business in a way that it needs to be served to grow in accordance with the plans that they have for it to grow. So if that is you are capturing demand, but it's not going to be for an affordable cost, meaning that the amount that you are spending outweighs the return that you're getting for that ad spend, or if you're running marketing activities that being told to do, like running gated ebooks that aren't generating any proper opportunities for sales, you need to look at what return on investment are we getting from these existing activities. Are we doing things that are going to help the business scale? If we just keep doing the same thing, can we meet the goals and targets that are set before us? And so, Kevin, I encourage our listeners to go back and listen to the episode on how to make a business case. But again, just on my whiteboard, I've just pulled out really what you need to be looking at. And if you are a very lead heavy business where marketing is tasked with generating MQLs and there's not a lot of thought into the quality of those, we really encourage people to calculate their return on investment there. And that's simply looking at, Kevin, what is the revenue that we got from these leads that marketing has sourced? And how much did it cost us to get those leads? So we're taking the revenue from the leads and the cost to get those leads. Again, we encourage our listeners, and this is up on our whiteboard, that when it goes to the cost to get those leads, it's not just the advertising cost. It's the cost of the marketing salaries that it took to generate those leads. It's the tools and tech that you use to track them. It's the advertising spend on top of that. It's also, Kevin, and this is where it gets a little scary, it's the salaries of the sales team that actually chase down those leads and turn them into paying customers. And that, Kevin, is often when a pretty scary picture is painted of, look, yes, we might be getting $300,000 in revenue, but when we add up all those expenses, often the marketing costs and the sales costs outweigh that, and we have a negative return on investment. And so that should very clearly signal to you, hey, we can't keep doing this. It is too inefficient an acquisition process to help us scale to that next phase that the business wants us to get to.
And listeners, what George has put up on the whiteboard is a very easy way to look at just the different buckets that you really need to take into account for, as he said. I think when you're working with, if you're big enough to work with agencies and the like, or you have someone in-house looking after your paid channels, often that analysis stops at ROAS, or an estimate of what ROI is. But if you're internal and if you're looking after the marketing function of the business, you can very easily then look past those points to get a much more accurate view of what your actual ROI is, not just your marketing ROI from paid channels. So you can look at things like marketing salary very easily. And you can look at things like how much does the tools and tech that you're actually using cost actually balance into that equation as well. Not just the advertising spend that's accounted for in that third row in that table. And then past that, as George said, the sales salaries really should be something you should be considering. Yes, you might not have control over the sales side of things, but at the same time, you still need to account for it. You still need to figure out whether the business is scalable or not, because whether or not you're responsible for the sales team and the salaries, at the end of the day, your head is probably going to be on the chopping block if the business isn't profitable. If you happen to find there's a massive impact on your analysis based on salaries from the sales team, which there probably is, then it's a cue for you to go and talk to sales team and to align and to work together on the same set of numbers that you have presented in this table once you've worked them out. And that's exactly what you should be doing. You should be aligned with sales. You should be working together to make sure that overall as a business, it's sustainable, the growth is there, and it's scalable. Otherwise, you need to work together to figure out what's the best way to get that ROI positive. Because if you're doing all things very well on your side, but something isn't happening on the other end, or vice versa, the problem is not going to be solved by us just blindly sticking our heads in the sand and ignoring the other half of the business and trying to do our best in our own space. Yes, you might be able to look after your own patch, but at the end of the day, you're in the same business together with your sales team, and you still need to make a profit as a business overall. So keep that in mind when you're looking at your overall ROI, what that actually is, and making that business case. And in fact, if you have these numbers which suggest that you're potentially not positive ROI overall as a business, or you're close to break even and you actually need to get that next lever to pull on, that's actually good news for you to make that business case, to take that first step towards demand generation.
Very good points, Kevin. And it is all about making that business case and showing to leadership why they need to change things from the status quo. No doubt at the moment, there's a lot of pressure on you to keep capturing any demand that is out there. And I've pulled up another graph, Kevin, that I've drawn on our whiteboard, which really on two axes shows probably what we've seen time and time again when working with businesses, when all they're doing is capturing demand. And on one axis, Kevin, you have your cost per acquisition. And on the other, the horizontal axes, we have time or spend. You could probably use either metric there. What we really see, Kevin, is when companies start out capturing demand, they manage to capture existing customers for a cost per acquisition that is very achievable. On the graph, we have a break-even point where you're acquiring a customer for, say, like $100 and you make $100 from that customer. That would be your break-even point. And companies tend to start at below that. And then as they expand into that 3% and try and capture more and more of that market, their cost per acquisition tends to go up. And what we suggest that you do to prove to leadership that this isn't going to scale forever is use any existing data points that you have to show that over time, your cost per acquisition cost has actually started to increase. And you can get signals and information and data from whatever platforms you're running, be it Google Ads or Meta, where you can actually forecast, Kevin, if we go and we spend more money and we bid on these other perhaps more generic terms, our cost per click is going to be this. Our cost per impression is going to be this. Our cost per lead, cost per opportunity is probably going to go up along with that. And then you can forecast and show, hey, look, actually, with the activities we're currently doing, we're forecast to have a cost per acquisition actually far beyond our break-even point. And that's what we show on that graph. And it's something that we see time and time again. Often in leadership's forecast, Kevin, they actually allow for people's conversion rates to be getting better over time. But what we find is in that point of scale where they try and scale into that 3% and beyond that 3%, your conversion rate actually stays the same or decreases. And that's because you're reaching a larger audience, you're scaling to a bigger audience, you're not as tailored, they're not as familiar with your brand, and they might not have as much intent to purchase as that initial group of people who are looking for a solution like yours right now.
Yes, and unfortunately, it is a pretty grim picture at that point and potentially a little too late to try and course correct and do things better. It doesn't mean that you're not doing all the right things in the demand capture side of things. You're probably doing a fantastic job at improving things on that side, but over time, naturally, as competition increases, as you start to scale, the CAC really just doesn't scale in the same vein. It doesn't stay the same. It usually goes up for all the different reasons that we talked about already. And effectively, you actually need to fix that demand generation side. That's the problem. That's the core issue that's creating this symptom. And again, if you're seeing this, if you're able to forecast this, if you're able to put that into your business case, then it makes that business case all the more compelling to start to invest in demand generation. But once you've made that decision and you've got the buy-in to do demand generation, how do you then go about starting that? How do you propose that first action, first project? That's step 2 of the 5 steps that we're going to go through in this episode. And that's cut out 10% of your budget from existing activities to put into a pilot program for demand generation. And I think there's a few qualifiers here that we can add to this simple step to make it a bit more successful. So obviously first there we've said to cut out 10% of your budget. It doesn't have to be 10% exactly, but if it's in that ballpark, it obviously puts you in a better position to have an easier conversation with leadership, with the sales team, with the rest of your marketing team. You're not disrupting things too much, but you're putting enough of a budget towards these new activities in demand generation. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be 10%. It can be lower, it can be higher, depending on how much appetite there is internally to get started with demand generation.
Kevin, we would encourage people to get started by looking, as you said, at those activities that really aren't helping drive the business forward. That starts with an audit of your existing activities. Jump into the platforms that you're spending the most money on. And for a lot of you, that's probably review platforms like G2 and Google Ads, possibly Meta as well. And go through and create reports that show if someone clicked on this keyword, what kind of lead opportunity did we get from this? What result did we get from this? And is there a return on investment on that? It's much easier to measure that capturing demand, Kevin, because they're people that are so much further down the funnel. It doesn't always have to be last click, but can we look at first click, last click, data driven and really say, you know what, let's just say that we are HubSpot and we are bidding on something like marketing automation software. There's a good chance that that's probably a great keyword for them. That's exactly what HubSpot does. It serves marketers. But if they're also bidding further up the funnel, something that has lower intent, like the benefits of marketing automation, someone who's probably solution aware, there's a good chance that doesn't have quite as good a return on investment. And so looking to cut spend from places that aren't helping drive the business forward when we're really trying to use that channel as something to capture high intent searches that are really driving revenue is a great place to start. Another thing you could do, Kevin, is really audit your search channels to see, are we bidding and showing our ads in locations where we just don't have a very strong brand awareness, or for some reason the customers aren't as great a fit for us? Unfortunately, in this circumstance, Kevin, I've picked on Vietnam, and I've said an example would be bidding on marketing automation system for Vietnam if you're HubSpot, and perhaps that is not the best fit for their region. I don't know, Kevin, but something worth diving into your data, looking at where are we not getting a great return and cutting spend from there.
Yeah, I think that's the important thing, isn't it, George? Looking at where you're not getting a return. It could be your search ads. It could be something as simple as potentially some lead gen activity you're already running, like gated ebooks or gated information and reports that aren't really getting good quality leads to your sales team. Potentially your sales team has given you the feedback that, oh, when you're doing these sort of ebooks, they don't seem to drive any sort of good leads that actually turn into sale opportunities. So that could be ebook one. Maybe we can cut that. Maybe we can cut the amount of resource that we put into doing that particular ebook and promoting it, whether it's on LinkedIn or Meta. Maybe we just don't do that activity and we try something else with that budget, because it's not actually giving any upside and it's actually probably slowing down your sales team in that particular case. You might have another ebook or another lead gen play that is working, ebook 2 in the example on the whiteboard there, which is actually driving 12 sales opportunities with the same kind of activity and investment level. Hey, let's keep that because that's actually working. We're not saying to cut that out. If there's good ROI, again, you should keep that. That is the consideration you should have here, is whether it's actually driving ROI for the business. And then as you start to get into demand generation, you can put more and more things into those ROI things that work for your particular business. And we're not saying that any part of the funnel, even in demand capture channels, potentially it's doing some of the lift for the demand generation work already. In some ways, you're exposing that brand to people who have lower intent to buy, but are in that discovery phase. It's still working. But you have to balance that with what is the opportunity cost there. If there's nothing else better to cut, maybe that's where you can start to cut from. And then you can start to reinvest that into demand generation, where potentially it could be a lot more cost effective to do some pure demand generation activities to really boost the overall demand, the overall slice of pie that you could potentially be in market for. So that will then in turn boost the demand capture channels as well.
That's it, Kevin. And the important thing is here, we're trying to take existing budget from an existing activity that you're doing. It's much easier to get this past leadership than going to them with your hat in your hand and asking for more money. Leadership, of course, are always thinking that marketing isn't using every dollar as efficiently as they could. So be the mature one, raise this first in your conversation when you present this opportunity to leadership, and then show them that you can just reallocate existing resources to then go to step 3, Kevin, which is creating the plan for demand gen and executing it.
And in this step, listeners, I think you should really focus in on one product, one segment, and then just focus on having a documented plan to roll that out in stages and just stick to that one pilot program, because it really focuses you in on executing that effectively. It builds that use case of actually demand generation works in the first place. So particularly if you're having a bit of difficulty in step 1 and 2, getting that buy-in from leadership, getting that buy-in from the wider sales team to be okay on board with everything. They might have begrudgingly or reluctantly said yes to doing some of this activity. Make sure that first project is doable, is actionable. And if you have to, just have that one person in sales. And we talked about this before in another episode, just have that one person in the sales team that you can partner with to roll out this pilot program to prove that case out, so that you can then take that back to the doubters, to the people who are putting a question mark over demand generation, and say, hey, this actually worked. Look how much more value we're able to drive with this demand generation activity versus what it was doing before on the demand capture side. And the easiest way to do that, to get that buy-in, is to focus in on that one product, one segment, and to go with that one plan to get that executed.
That's right, Kevin. So, listeners, if your company sells multiple products and you're responsible for marketing all of them, like so many of you are, pick one product. I'm sure that they sell that product to multiple ideal customers. Pick one ideal customer, ideally the one that gets the most out of that product and is the best fit for it. And that way we can focus our limited attention and limited resources on just that one product and that one segment. And then, Kevin, of course, creating a demand generation plan, a documented demand generation plan with exactly who it is that you're going to target, what the buying committee looks like, what we need to do to build relationships with each of them, how we're going to create content that's going to build relationships with them at scale, and then how we're going to shift those who are expressing some kind of intent and accelerating that demand to then closing that and turning that into one revenue. We want to document all of that, Kevin, because then we know what plan we have to follow and we can just chip away at it bit by bit. We don't want to do random acts of marketing. That's the worst thing you can do at this stage. You've made a business case. You've taken budget from somewhere. You need a plan to then roll this out step by step. And to complement this strategic plan, Kevin, we need to look at what are the list of tasks along with the deadlines to execute this plan. You and I love Gantt charts. This is, look, on the whiteboard, it's a very simplified version of essentially what we work through every day, Kevin. We have taken our demand strategy just in a simple Google sheet. We have all the months of the year worked out, and we've broken it down to the exact task and the exact person that's responsible for executing it and the timeline that we want that executed by. And it's just so important to have that and have that written down, because then it holds you accountable. You can do repeatable actions. You can get into habits, and then you know that you've put in the work. So when it comes to actually looking back and measuring and see, how did we do? Well, we know that we have gone and properly executed the plan.
So important, isn't it, George, to have that plan in place. It's another one of those things that we see a lot of the time, where you get the buy-in from leadership, you've proved out the case for it, but then when you start to run that first test, you didn't continue to do that documentation. You didn't lay out that plan in working through things. Some things might get delayed, things pop up, particularly in smaller businesses where there's a lot of demands on you as a marketer within a small marketing team. And so it's very hard to keep track of what is that demand generation project happening at the moment? How is that tracking? And so it's very important to have these sort of documentations in place to ensure its success. It might seem very mundane, very small thing that doesn't really have that much impact at the beginning, but we find that having that actual plan in place, having it to the point where it's specified out in terms of tasks and when that time, what that timeline looks like for completing those tasks, it really holds everything accountable around that project to ensure its success, or giving it the best chance for success. So make sure to have that plan ready, create your plan and demand generation in that step 3.
And then go ahead and make sure you're measuring the leading indicators of success, the things that say, hey, we aren't actively contributing pipeline right now, but these are the signs of life to know that we're on the right track. And then the lagging indicators. How can we look backwards and say, oh, look, that demand generation strategy and activities that we did to support it, they're actually driving pipeline. And if you just Google how to measure demand generation, our article should definitely be on the first page, hopefully result number 1 or 2 by the time this episode is released, Kevin. And we detail the 3 tiers of measurement that you should be using to measure your demand gen programs.
All right, now that you have that plan in place, what do you do from there? Very simply, assign people to tasks. And that might seem like a very small fourth step to have as a separate step, but it's so important. Once you have that plan, once you have that timeline in place, you actually need to assign the right people to the different tasks to make sure it actually happens. Put that responsibility on the relevant people so that they're aware of it and they can work along those task deadlines. So that might be yourself within the marketing team. You might be working with freelancers. You might be working with internal teams, whether that's a content team that you might be lucky to have and work with, or maybe even leadership and subject matter experts within your business who need to provide you with some of the information to complete certain tasks. All those things should be in the plan to make sure that you are setting up this first demand gen program for success. You've got everyone that you need on that plan tailored to particular tasks, names in particular tasks, so that they can be held accountable, and alongside yourself being held accountable, so that, again, you have the best chance of making this pilot program a success, because it's so important to get that first pilot program right, particularly in demand generation, which can be quite different and quite jarring for a lead gen led business or sales led business to get on board with.
And that, Kevin, takes us to step 5, which is, again, measure the leading and lagging indicators. And if something is working, scale it up. And there's a bunch of different things we can do, Kevin, to scale up what's already working. That could be using some additional budget to really accelerate this process. It might be using it to push your ads to your dream customers and guaranteeing that the buying committee are seeing all that super helpful content. It could be rolling it out to a second product. Once we have a great system, we said start with one product and one segment. It might be rolling this out to another product, or it might be rolling this out to another segment. And then finally, scaling this up might be, how can we get more people involved? And that might be insourcing, outsourcing, getting sales to do some of this, getting the other people on your team in your company to start doing some employee advocacy. There's so many different ways that we can scale these efforts up. And that's really step 5. And Kevin, that's how we transition from lead generation to demand generation.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be very difficult when you lay out all the different steps. You just have to go through it fairly methodically. Like everything else in the framework, it is something that you can tackle step by step to get to the result that you're after. And as George said, once you get to that end that you desire, where you've got that demand generation pilot program going and it's a success, you've shown the results and it's measured up to all the metrics of success that was agreed upon when you made that business case, when you came up with that initial plan. Great, you can then scale it and you can start on that journey of really scaling up your demand generation practice, and even to the point where you start automating certain things. So it might be a matter of bringing more people in, or it might be a matter of bringing in more tech to automate certain steps of that journey as you put in the reps and you figure out what's actually working on the demand generation side. But it all starts with that simple step of making a business case and then looking at how do people respond to that? How can we get that pilot program going? So that's the 5 steps, listeners. The key takeaways for this episode then is, first, you need to make a business case for demand generation to get that buy-in before executing it. And that is what starts the transition from lead gen to demand generation. And of course, that process should be gradual to minimize the resistance to change and also the negative impacts on your business and on teams within your business. And finally, you need a demand generation plan that details the strategy, the tactics, the people, and the timelines needed to get your pilot program off the ground and stay on course to become a success. And this is exactly what we give you in our 12-week program, the B2B Incubator. So all the things that you need, the templates, the tools, as well as a cohort potentially that you can go through the program with in that 12 weeks to set up your demand generation program, to set up everything you need and document everything you need within that demand generation plan to help you execute that plan as well in your own time, but within that 12-week period, you will be ready to go from nothing at all on the demand generation side to something that's ready to go, that is set up within your business to start driving demand.
That's it. You don't have to take this all on yourself. You can join the program, join other marketers like you going through the exact same thing, and you get to have live Q&As with Kevin and myself to make sure that you're implementing this strategy and the tactics to back it effectively. Thank you, listeners. As always, you can find links to everything that we discussed in the show notes. And Kevin and I are just so grateful that every week more and more marketers are tuning in every Monday to the B2B Playbook, both as our podcast and on YouTube. And Kev, we always have long form articles to complement all of our episodes now as well, which is pretty awesome for those who love to read. And if we could ask one thing, it would be to please pass on the show to someone who you think would get value from it. And make sure you check us out on YouTube, especially this Demand Gen mini-series. We put a lot of effort into this whiteboard. There's a lot of diagrams, things to hopefully get these concepts across a little quicker. It's a huge help to us. It's a huge help to our future listeners if you pass the show on, and we really, really appreciate it. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, listeners, viewers, and readers. Catch you next week.
Thank you, George. Thank you, everyone who tunes in. Take care and catch you all next week.